Welcome to our look at the attack on Pearl Harbor. This is the battle that drew the United States into World War II. It was December 7th, 1941. Let's go ahead and take a look at some of the details. Before we can even talk about Pearl Harbor, we should probably talk about World War II in general. There's a very long lead-up of many events that caused World War II to come into play. Many look back at the ending of even World War I and the Treaty of Versailles, which ended that war, and how that punished Germany severely for World War I, forced them to take responsibility for the entire war, forced them to pay millions of dollars in reparations. And that, coupled with the Great Depression, which did affect Germany and Europe, they were ripe for allowing somebody like Hitler to come in and say, hey, I can fix your nation. So as Hitler comes to power in 1932, he starts to overhaul Germany and tries to rebuild their economy. He doesn't rebuild it in a positive way, but rebuilds it in a very militaristic way. Eventually, September 1st, 1939, Nazi Germany invades Poland and war breaks out in Europe. As a response to this, though, America chooses to stay neutral. Basically, we are trying to say, that's Europe's war, Hitler's not going to affect us, we don't want anything to do with your war. Soon after September 1st, 1939, Nazi Germany does ally themselves with Imperial Japan. Japan, on the other side of the globe, had a strong feeling of superiority. It truly felt it was the greatest nation on earth and that its people were superior to all. It did feel the need to expand its empire. Because of this strong superiority complex, but also because it felt it needed natural resources. As a chain of islands, Japan had a finite series of resources. It only had so much oil. Since oil was the backbone of any industrial nation and its army or navy, Japan did feel the need to expand. Ultimately, Japan knew that if they expanded throughout the South Pacific, that the United States and other allies would probably stop it. They knew that the United States was a very strong force, and if motivated, could use its navy to do some damage upon Japan. So Japan knew that they were probably going to face the United States in war. And so if they were going to, they wanted to face the U.S. on their terms. So, as a preemptive strike, Japan decided to make an attack plan against Pearl Harbor, where the United States Navy had recently been stationed. Japan's goal was to knock out the United States aircraft carriers, those long boats that have the ability to land and take off aircraft. Japan knew that if the United States got into a war with them, and that the American people were behind the war effort, Japan knew it would lose. So its only hope of being able to accomplish its goals of expansion throughout Southeast Asia, their only hope was to knock out the American aircraft carriers and disable the American fleet in one quick victory. So how did the attack work? Japan began sending the United States a series of memos called the 14 Points. These were small messages in Japanese that basically started communicating with the United States and saying kind of odd things like, we have no desires to expand. It is you, the United States, who is aggressive, and forces like Germany and Italy are doing a great thing to stabilize the world, and you, the United States, are being mean. At one point, the memo demands that the U.S. give Japan oil, because as Japan had begun its expansion, the U.S. had cut off all oil supplies to it. While all of this is going on, the Japanese ambassadors are negotiating with U.S. ambassadors in trying to figure out how to ease tensions in the Pacific. Ultimately, the final part of the message was that Japan said, because of your horrible U.S. aggression, we, Japan, have only one option, and that is to start a war. Now here's where it breaks down a little bit. That final memo was to be delivered at approximately 8 a.m. on Sunday, December 7th, and then almost immediately after that, the battle was to start. Unfortunately for Japan, in terms of public opinion, that message was delivered too late. Times had not been perfectly coordinated, things had been a little jumbled. The attack on Pearl Harbor had happened, and then after that, the memo had been given to the U.S. ambassador saying, the only thing we can do is war, thus proving that the plan to attack Pearl Harbor had been in motion for a while, and that these 14 points were not honest negotiating attempts. They were designed to stall the U.S. in terms of preparation, while Japan moved her aircraft carriers and hundreds of airplanes into the vicinity so they could start bombing Pearl Harbor as a surprise attack.
Smart enemy. Gets you exactly where you think you're safe.
So the attack itself began on Sunday, December 7th, 1941. It was supposed to start at 8 a.m. It started a little bit earlier. Like we had said, this was before that final part of the memo had been handed to the Americans. The Japanese figured that on a Sunday, many Americans would be hanging out, perhaps going to church, getting up a little bit later, and that an attack on a Sunday would be a good idea. They also figured that around this time, many American troops would be on holiday leave, and so an already relaxed atmosphere on a military base would be even further relaxed, being near holiday breaks and on a Sunday morning. The Japanese attacked with approximately 350 planes, a mix of straight-up bombers and torpedo bombers that would release torpedoes in hopes of sinking ships that were inside Pearl Harbor. In addition, they did station some small submarines outside the mouth of Pearl Harbor, so if any of the American ships were to try and escape the attack, the goal was for them to be sunk by these submarines if they escaped the harbor itself. As mentioned before, the goal of the Japanese attack was to sink the American aircraft carriers. Fortunately for us, bad for them, our aircraft carriers were not in Pearl Harbor. They had just recently been sent out into the open ocean for some maneuvers, and so while this attack was headed for those carriers, they were not there. But the attack did some major damage on destroyers, battleships, and others. It did kill approximately 2,300 servicemen, lasted about 90 minutes. Only 64 Japanese were killed in this attack, and they lost approximately 100 planes. The results, in terms of the Japanese victory, they destroyed about 300 airplanes. They did sink 8 battleships right there in the harbor, 3 cruisers and 3 destroyers. Again, none of the aircraft carriers were there. On the American side, some of the results were that because this seemed to be such a deceptive and surprise attack, Americans were A, extremely upset at being attacked at all, and B, extremely upset at being attacked under false pretenses. It seemed like we were negotiating with the Japanese, and they seemed to sneak in behind there and plan this massive battle. As a result, the type of hatred that was directed toward Germans during World War II was significantly different than how we hated the Japanese at this point. It was a very unifying factor in America in terms of getting Americans behind the war effort. Of course, this fuel was ratcheted up with American propaganda that continued to show the Japanese as sneaky, backstabbing, some sort of subhumans. I'm sure this also had some amount of play in the idea of interning the Japanese Americans with Executive Order 9066, which basically allowed the United States Army to round up anyone of Japanese ancestry on the Western coast and move them to prison camps for the duration of the war. So if we look back upon this attack, probably not labeled a battle, but more of an attack, in order for the Japanese aircraft carriers to get close enough to Hawaii, there is the implication that this had been well planned. They had been thinking of this attack for weeks before it actually happened. The Japanese had also been planning and training their pilots on other islands that looked similar to Oahu and Pearl Harbor. They had also modified their torpedoes in order to run very shallow in Pearl Harbor, which is a very shallow draft. The normal torpedoes would go very deep and then kind of spring up and run along the surface, but the Japanese had done a lot of reconnaissance, had the use of some spies, and they knew that Pearl Harbor was relatively shallow, so they went ahead and modified those torpedoes. So clearly, this had to have been planned weeks in advance. At the same time, they were using the 14 points not as a true negotiating tool, but as something that was to deceive the United States and to delay the entrance of the U.S. into this battle, and to catch the U.S. unguarded. Ultimately, after the battle ended on December 7th, the U.S. declared war on Japan on December 8th. And then, because of all the alliances and how the war had already started, the U.S. was drawn into World War II. That's about all we have on the attack on Pearl Harbor. As always, bring in any questions you might have. We'll seek to fill in any gaps in class, and we will go from there. Thanks a lot. Have a good one.